Thank you. Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Institute for Governmental Studies. It's a pleasure to be partnering with them in presenting the Concord Coalition Fiscal Wake Up Tour. I want to say a personal word of thanks to the Concord Coalition for all they've done for our country, and in the specific for bringing this fiscal tour to our campus. The fiscal tour participants will be introduced in sequence as each of them speaks, and following their presentations, each of which will be 8 minutes, we'll then get into a dialogue and question and answer. So our first speaker is Bob Bixby, who is the Executive Director of the Concord Coalition. He has held that position since 1999. Prior to that, he was the Program Director for the Concord Coalition. Concord Coalition was established in 1992 by the late Senator Tsongas and Senator Warren Rudman. And after Senator Tsongas's passing, Senator Bob Kerrey, former senator from Nebraska, became the co-chair. So it's always been bipartisan from its very inception, focused on the fiscal responsibility issues you'll hear about tonight. Executive Director Bixby holds his bachelor's degree from the American University, his law degree from George Mason University, and a master in public administration from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Robert Bixby.
Thank you very much, Dean Campbell. And I should say everybody's been saying nice things thanking the Concord Coalition, but it is we do take the lead on the logistics, but our partners in this are the Heritage Foundation, the Brookings Institution, and Dave Walker from the Government Accountability Office, and so it's a joint effort of several organizations coming together on the Fiscal Wake Up Tour. And we have indeed been going around the country following, we've been to places like New Hampshire and Iowa and South Carolina and Florida. If you're seeing a pattern here, you might understand that we're sort of looking at some of the key presidential states, and this year we'll be going to some of the battleground states. It's not as if any of us is going to run for anything. People understand that after they hear what we've had to say. It's a slightly different message than they're used to hearing it. But we know that that the next president is going to have to make some crucial decisions, and so it's important for voters, whether they favor Republicans or favor Democrats or independents, whatever, to know that candidates appreciate the magnitude of the fiscal challenges facing our nation, appreciate the need to make some trade-offs in finding solutions, and the importance of acting sooner rather than later. Now, when the next president takes office, they're going to do so with a budget deficit of about $400 billion. That means that the government will be spending about $400 billion more than it's taking in. That is a challenge, but in fact, it is not the really big challenge. It's actually more the tip of the iceberg. Deficits of this size, often in the past, have been caused by factors that are at play now, such as a slowing economy and war. There's a big difference this time, and the big difference is the really big challenge that we're here to talk about and have been on the Fiscal Wake Up Tour. The difference is that the nation is entering an unprecedented demographic transformation to an older society. And we're doing that against the backdrop of rising healthcare costs and very low national savings. And the combination of all of those is a very lethal one for the future health of the economy. Consider three factors. Right now, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, the three biggest federal entitlement programs, comprise 42% of the federal budget. That's quite a bit, and if you keep in mind that the baby boomers haven't really begun to retire yet, just now beginning to qualify for early retirement under Social Security. Now you add in the demographic factors, and you can see that that will put a lot more pressure on these three programs. The percentage of the population age 65 and over is going to go from about 12% today to about 20% over the next 25 years. But demographics alone aren't the only problem. On top of that are rising healthcare costs. Healthcare costs have been rising faster than the economy for the past 40 years by a rate of about 2.5% a year. And if the same growth happens over the next 40 years, that is, healthcare costs rising relative to the size of the economy, if the same growth rates were to persist for the next 40 years as we've had for the past 40 years, you would find that just two programs, Medicare and Medicaid, would take up as much of the federal budget as much of our nation's economy as the entire federal budget does today. Now, other speakers will talk about some of the implications of that for the future. I'd like to drop back now just to the present and show you a freeze frame of last year's federal budget and where it came out. And this is where we ended up on a cash basis with a deficit of $163 billion. But the thing I would like you to note is that top line on the spending side. That is the net interest. The government spent about $238 billion on interest. Now, when the government runs debts, it has to pay interest when it borrows money, just like anybody else. And $238 billion is almost 10% of the federal budget. It's quite a bit of spending. It's more than the government spent on, say, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's more than the federal government's share of the Medicaid program. So if you occasionally hear people say that deficits don't matter, this is a very if they didn't matter, we wouldn't be paying $238 billion, or about 10% of the budget. Now, changing course. Let me, before we change course, let's talk about where things stand as a percentage of the economy. Very often, people will talk about these issues as a percentage of GDP, as a percentage of the economy. It's a more relevant way of looking at these things than dollar figures alone. And if you look at this, you see that more or less by coincidence, we're not too far off our historic rates at the present time. Generally speaking, the government over the past 25, 30 years or so has tended to spend at about 21% of GDP, and revenues are a little bit above 18% of GDP. So we run these deficits around 2%. Now, if that were the pattern going out into the future, we might be concerned and would like to see lower budget deficits, but we probably wouldn't be running around doing a fiscal wake-up tour. Keep these numbers in mind as you hear what the other speakers say about where spending may be headed as a percentage of the economy. Now, changing course is going to require some fundamental decisions, and the American people need to be involved in those decisions, and that's where the fiscal wake-up tour comes in. This guy on the horse here is Paul Revere. And the reason that we show Paul Revere is not just because this is the Concord Coalition, so we have to talk about Paul Revere, but he symbolizes what we're doing here. This is not about gloom and doom. It's a warning. And we think that the American people and their leaders can change course if they are adequately informed. Members of the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour do not agree on the right level of spending, taxes, and debt, but we do agree on the following points. We all agree that current policy is unsustainable, that there are no quick and easy solutions that people like to talk about, like cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, or just simply trying to grow our way out of it. We all agree that there are going to need to be bipartisan solutions. Both sides need to be willing to look at all options. Public engagement is very important to this. That's why we're out here doing this. And finally, and most importantly to us, this is really a moral issue. It's not just about numbers. It's about the legacy that we leave to future generations. Tom, are you going to introduce the next speaker, or do you want me to do it?
Sure.
I will, in introducing the next speaker, just let you know that he has been from time to time referred to as the rock star of the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour. And it's not often that a government accountant or a CPA of any sort is referred to as a rock star. So that's something to aspire to. He is the Comptroller General of the United States, the rock star of the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour, David Walker.
Before David speaks, I do want to just inform staff and faculty alike that the Office of the Comptroller General was appointed in 1921, that David is the 8th in that office. It's a 15-year term, so he's protected politically. He's appointed by the Congress of the United States, not responsible to the executive branch, and is as close as we can come to an independent voice in federal government.
And I'll also note, since we're meeting here in the Arthur Anderson Auditorium, that I was a partner with Arthur Anderson and global managing director for 9.5 years before they had their problems. I had nothing to do with Enron, WorldCom, waste management, you fill in the blank, but in any event. And also, in the interest of full and fair disclosure, 1 week from today will be my last day at GAO, because I'm going to become the CEO of a new foundation, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, which will be focused on this and other sustainability challenges, because Washington is broken badly, and there need to be a lot more aggressive efforts in order to try to be able to help make sure that elected officials make tough choices sooner rather than later. And frankly, I've gone about as far as I can as Comptroller General, and you need to go further. So we're going to bring more flexibility and financial resources to the target to hope that we can end up getting some results sooner rather than later. But with that, let me talk to you a little bit about where the budget has been, where we are, and where we're headed. And it's the last part that's the problem. It's not today, it's not the past, it's where we're headed. We're headed into very rough seas that could swamp the ship of state if we don't get serious soon. In 1967, 45% of the federal budget was for defense, and 2% was for Medicare and Medicaid. In 2007, 21% was for Medicare and Medicaid, and 20% for national defense. In 1967, when the Congress came to Washington, they got to decide how 2/3 of the federal budget would be spent. In 2007, it was down to 38%. Stated differently, 62% of the federal budget was on autopilot, and a significant portion of that 62% is represented by blank check. The United States is the only country on the face of the earth that writes a blank check for health care cost. No one can afford to write a blank check for health care cost, including the United States, because if there's one thing that could bankrupt America, it's runaway health care costs. Now, interestingly, those of you that are connoisseurs of the Constitution, as I am, will find that if you go back and look at the express and enumerated responsibilities the Founding Fathers ascribed to the federal government at the beginning of our republic, all of those are in the 38% of the budget that's getting squeezed. National defense, homeland security, federal judicial system, Treasury, foreign policy, postal, Congress of the United States, executive office of the president, and yet they're getting squeezed. The federal government has 3 deficit numbers. I wouldn't say it has 3 sets of books, but it definitely has 3 deficit numbers. And guess which ones elected officials like to talk about? The least bad numbers, the middle set of numbers. But when you look at the fact that the federal government spends every dime of the Social Security surplus on other government operating expenses, the real cash-based budget deficit is marked in red. And guess what? That $163 billion number for 07 is going to be $410 in 08, and you can add to that $410 about another $180 billion that will be spent in the form of the Social Security surplus being spent on something else. The United States has become addicted to debt. We're running deficits in good times and bad, adding to our debt burdens, and unfortunately, too many American families are following the bad example of their federal government. They're spending more than they make, and increasing their debt burdens. Bottom line on this graphic, it may be a little bit difficult to follow, is while the three deficit numbers have gone down for 3 years in a row, the accumulated liabilities and unfunded commitments for Social Security and Medicare are going up every year. And as I just mentioned, the deficit is set to escalate dramatically this year. Here's the real problem. Forget about deficits. Forget about current debt. That's not the real problem. The real problem is this graphic. In the last 7 years alone, the total liabilities and unfunded commitments for Social Security and Medicare, the difference between what has been promised and the amount of dedicated payroll taxes and premiums to deliver on those promises, the gap in current dollar terms has grown from $20 trillion, there's 12 zeros to the right of that 20, to $53 trillion in 7 years. From 20 to 53 in 7 years. And the Medicare prescription drug benefit alone is $8.4 trillion, and Medicare is $34 trillion of the $53 trillion. Now, how do you translate $53 trillion into something that we might be able to relate to? It's 90% of the estimated net worth of every American. It's $175,000 per person, including each newborn. It's $440,000 per household, and median household income in America is less than $50,000 a year, believe it or not. And by the way, that $53 trillion number is going up $2 to $3 trillion a year by doing nothing. That's the cost of waiting. 7 years ago, this is what our fiscal future looked like. The line represents revenues as a percentage of the economy. The bar represents spending. You can see that we had short-term surpluses and fiscal sustainability for 40-plus years. We actually thought we were going to pay off all the national debt in January of 2001. That's why you don't see any blue line at the bottom of the bar, because it was all paid off. We don't have to worry about that anymore. This is where we stand today, based upon reasonable assumptions. Reasonable assumptions are no Social Security and Medicare reform, which we can't allow to happen, but if you assume that we tax at historical levels of about 18.5% of the economy, which is where we are now, and we just debt finance the difference, and that the rest of government grows by the rate of the economy. This is not just a federal problem, it's a state-local problem. Bottom line of this graphic, state and local governments face large and growing deficits within the next 10 years due primarily to 4 reasons. Medicaid cost, unfunded retiree health care, underfunded pension plans, and deferred maintenance and other critical infrastructure needs. So the bottom line is the status quo is not an option. There's no way we're going to grow our way out of this problem. Anybody who tells you we can do that, 1, hasn't studied economic history, and number 2, probably wouldn't pass math. So we need to be honest about where we are and where we're headed. We need to reimpose tough budget controls like the ones expired in 2002. We need to reform our legislative processes to consider the longer-term cost and affordability of tax and spending proposals. And we're going to need to transform our entitlement programs, the base of spending, and tax policy. It's a heavy lift, but we're going to have to do it all in installments over the next few years. Believe it or not, this great nation, possibly the greatest in the history of mankind, on a set of key outcome-based indicators is ranked 16 out of number 30 for major industrialized nations. I can tell you that as a certified public accountant, that is officially below average. We can, we must, and I believe if we get serious, we will do better. The sooner we get started, the easier it'll be. Public education engagement is critical, but keep in mind, this is not just about numbers. It's about values. And I'll give you a word, stewardship. And I'll also let you know that it's not just about values, it's about people. And here's who it's about for me. These are my 3 grandchildren. I got married at 19. I've been married to the same woman for 36 years. These are our grandchildren. They didn't cause this problem. It's their problem. They're going to pay the price. They're going to bear the burden if tough choices aren't made, and they're obviously too young to vote. They don't have a voice. Their granddaddy is their voice. Thank you.
Alice Rivlin is our next speaker. She has just about every major position in fiscal responsibility in federal government. She was the founding director of the Congressional Budget Office. She was the vice chair of the Federal Reserve. She was the director of the Office of Management and Budget. She was an assistant secretary in the administration of President.
Oh, you don't have to talk about that.
Simply too many credentials. Received her master's and PhD from Radcliffe College of Harvard University and her undergraduate degree from Bryn Mawr.
Right.
Alice Rivlin.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to be very retro. I'm not going to use slides. I'm here with my colleagues from across the political spectrum because I share with them a strong conviction that Americans are not facing up to a really big problem that we've created for ourselves. We've made more commitments to spend federal money than we can afford to keep. These commitments or promises are built into the three big programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We need to re-examine those commitments to look at the resources that we will have available over the coming years, the other claims on them, and decide what to do. Doing nothing is not an option. Now, this problem is not insoluble. Sometimes when we talk in trillions and all of these big numbers, it sounds like, oh, we could never do anything about that. There are many solutions, but it won't solve itself, and the longer we wait, the more painful the choices are going to be. Now, these are good kinds of problems to have. They grew out of good intentions to protect seniors and the disabled and low-income people from loss of income and from the rising cost of medical care. And it's a good thing to have people living longer, and health care is more effective, and that's good too. But it's also more expensive. But these successes and good intentions create serious problems for the federal budget. The Comptroller General is an accountant, and he likes to think in present value terms of unfunded liabilities, and that gets you into an awful lot of trillions. I'm an economist, and I like to think about how much programs are costing as a percent of everything we produce, our GDP. Now, Social Security costs about 4% of our GDP right now. Over the next few years, it'll rise to 6%. That's the demographic effect of keeping the promises that we've already made. That's half again as much as we're spending now, but it doesn't sound impossible. It's the growth of Medicare and Medicaid, which is more dramatic because these programs are on track to claim a continuously rising share of the GDP. They compound the two factors, the aging of the population and the rising health care spending per person. As Bob Bixby said, health care spending for all of us has been going up about 2.5 percentage points faster than the GDP for 40 years. It doesn't take very much sophistication to realize that that's a problem, and it affects all of us. If these trends continue, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid will get to the 18 or 20% of the whole economy that we are now spending on the whole federal government by the end of the 2030s. Now, maybe we can find a way to reduce the rapid growth of healthcare spending. We certainly should try. Maybe we can reduce it to 2% faster than the GDP, or 1.5%. Or even if we're lucky, 1. But new drugs and new treatments are coming online all the time, and we're going to want them, and we're going to use them, and they're going to be more expensive. So I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that healthcare spending is going to drop to the rate of the GDP. And if that's true, then Medicare and Medicaid, or their successor programs, will continue to grow faster than all of our spending, and that federal revenues grow at any reasonable set of tax rates. So the result is very tough choices. What do? We raise taxes continuously. We keep cutting other spending until it's all gone. We push costs onto the state or into the private sector. Probably some combination of all of those things. The option we've been relying on recently is don't think about it, just borrow more money. We've been spending more than we've been taking in taxes and passing the IOUs on to future taxpayers, those terribly attractive grandchildren of the Comptroller General. I've got some too. But in the face of the rapidly rising commitments under Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, that option, just borrow more money, is not either economically or morally viable. It's economically dangerous. Rising deficits reduce economic growth through their effect on pushing up interest rates. They make us much more vulnerable to our creditors, and our creditors are mostly now foreign governments. And the task of, or the toll of the downside of keeping on borrowing more money is beginning to become apparent in the falling dollar. We've seen it already, and it could get much worse. The economics of continuous borrowing are not attractive, but it's also immoral. It's not fair to our children and our grandchildren to pass the burden on to them or to leave them with a damaged economy. So why are we acting in this immoral and short-sighted way? It's a little hard to figure. We're somehow in psychological denial. We cling to a whole bunch of convenient myths that we can grow our way out of the deficits. No, we can't. We'd have to grow at double-digit rates forever to catch up with this rate of spending. That we can cut taxes and that'll stimulate the economy and then we'll grow faster and taxes will pay for themselves. No, they won't. Tax cuts are stimulative of the economy, but no serious economist believes that you can go on cutting taxes without cutting spending and not create serious problems for the economy. Or the opposite. Oh, well, we'll just raise taxes. They're not as high as the Europeans, and we'll solve our problem that way. No, we won't, because we'd have to raise them continuously to solve this problem. Or we'll just cut waste. That's a good idea, and making the healthcare system more efficient is a good idea, but it's not going to solve the problem. All of these myths are partial truths. They're good things to do, but not solutions. We need to stop telling ourselves stories and admit that we have a problem. Make decisions about how much we want to spend on what and how to pay for it. Those are conversations that we are not now having, either in the context of the political campaign or very much of anywhere. And that's what the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour is trying to bring to your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. Acosta Fraser is our last speaker. She is the director of the Institute for Economic Studies at the Heritage Foundation, a position that she's held since 2003. Prior to that, she held the job that I did in California. She held it in Oklahoma. She was the finance director for the state and helped Governor Keating with his fiscal and economic policies. And prior to that, she was a fiscal manager for Orange County after it got into trouble. So the same sort of caveat that we heard about Arthur Anderson applies to Ms. Fraser, and help them work out their budgetary problems following their near bankruptcy. Ms. Fraser.
Thank you very much. I'm going to build on my colleagues' presentations and illustrate the challenges that we face, as well as some of the choices. And I'm going to start with a brief review of what you've already heard. Okay, let's get the thing to work here. And let's look historically at where we are in terms of the budgetary context. Taxes, remember, you heard, are about 18% of the economy, and that's really the post-World War II average, while spending has averaged about 20% of the economy. And if you notice the blue, that represents Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And you can see how over the past, since 1975 in this chart, they have really grown tremendously. And in my mind, one of the key reasons for that is that entitlements really function on budget autopilot. Now, most programs, those that Dave especially talked about, all the other priorities, including those things enumerated in the Constitution, most of those programs, Congress sets annual budgets that are constrained, and they have serious debates about our budgetary priorities. However, there are no annual budgets for entitlements. Instead, they grow in concert with the formulas that are established in their authorizing laws. So what this sets up in the future is a giant tsunami of spending. So we would see within 2 generations, the federal budget going from 20% of the economy to 50% of the economy. And this obviously is a real problem. And what would happen, as you heard my colleagues say, is that these entitlements would in fact begin to crowd out other priorities that we hold very valuable as a nation. Now, on this path, what would happen if interest rates increased as we have ever larger deficits and debt? Well, you see here, with a very modest interest rate increase, the fiscal meltdown happens even sooner. And what I want you to think about is, because of this budgetary autopilot nature of entitlements, this is the course that we are on today, and all of the legislative dynamics, all of the budget dynamics support and enforce this path. So let's talk for a moment about taxes, because no conversation about fiscal and budget policy is really complete without a discussion of taxes. And let's think about, first of all, where are they going in the future? And the red line right here, it shows you where we are today in comparison with the historical average, and we're actually right about that today. And according to current law, however, taxes are set to go up. And in fact, they are set to surpass the highest levels of taxation this nation has ever seen in 11 years. Why is that? That's due to the huge increase in the alternative minimum tax, and because the tax cuts are set to expire. But even if taxes are allowed to rise to this level, it will not solve this fiscal challenge that we face. Now, if the tax cuts are extended, you see that there's a little budgetary difference, but not a large one, and moreover, taxes will be increasing over the levels that we have today. And I'd like just to illustrate the magnitude of this problem to you. If the challenge was solved solely through taxes, you would see a tax burden growing from this 18% level today to 30% of the economy. That is a startling level, and not only that, taxes would need to keep on going up in the future as the costs of these programs continue to expand. So now you're probably thinking, I don't really know what 30% of the economy means to me and means to my family. So let's think about it in terms of income tax rates. What we would see is today's income tax rates needing to grow by 2.5 times, such that the lowest income tax rate today is 10%. It would need to grow to 26%. The highest rate would go from 35% to 92%. And this is only federal income taxes. You'd have to add on state income taxes, which in California are very high. You'd have to add on payroll taxes of about 7.5%. This is the level of taxation that we have locked in order to pay for these programs. Now, nobody's proposing this, but I really want you to think about what this magnitude is. And I want to say, I don't have any grandkids yet, but I do have 3 teenagers, and this is the burden that they will have to pay. But in spite of all the angst that they give me as teenagers, in spite of all the high blood pressure that they give me, you know, I really want a different future for them. I think that we can do better. So I'm going to turn to the other part of the budget, and that's the spending part. So what would happen, you know, if we continue on this current path, as Alice talked about, and just left these entitlements alone and tried to do things solely on the spending side of the ledger? It's very, very difficult. Watch as I start to eliminate some programs, and watch very, very closely. I'm going to eliminate sort of across priorities. I'm going to start with the National Endowment for the Arts. Watch the line closely. You didn't see it go down, and I eliminated an entire program. So now we'll eliminate NASA. Went down a little bit. Foreign aid, all earmark spending. And in fact, I have eliminated dozens of programs and literally tens of thousands of projects and not made very much progress towards this budget impasse. In fact, you could eliminate the entire Department of Defense tomorrow and you wouldn't solve the problem over the long term. So this is to illustrate to you, we really must change the direction of entitlements. So let me lay out briefly my path, and you've heard a number of other ideas, my sort of suggestions for solving this problem. I really think that the key is changing the legislative dynamics and the legislative incentives for action. That would mean taking these programs off of this budgetary autopilot that they're on. I would put them on a long-term constrained budget. And one of the benefits of this is that it would level the playing field among all budgetary priorities and require tough and conscious trade-offs. We don't have those today, and that's why you see those programs growing so fast, and especially in the future. Another thing that I would do is to include a measure of the long-term entitlement obligations, that $53 trillion that Dave talked about, in the annual budget. And if Congress really wanted to increase that $175,000 burden on Dave's grandkids, they should have to take a tough vote in order to do that. Another thing that I would do is to make retirement programs fair but affordable. And if I've conveyed nothing else today, it is that the social insurance model for entitlement programs that we have today is not sustainable. So I think there's a number of things that we can do. This would really involve two steps in my view. The first one is to target resources to those who need them the most, and there's a number of ways that we can do that. The second is that I think we all need to assume greater personal responsibility in terms of saving for our retirement future, and those are our foreseeable retirement needs. I do think that taxes have a role in this. And in my view, taxes should be simple, they should be flat, growth-oriented, and internationally competitive. So in closing, this is a very tough challenge that we face, but there are real solutions, and we look forward to taking your questions on those right now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well done, thanks. I'm going to engage in a discussion with the panel while we collect your questions. So if you would please pass them to the aisle now. They'll be sorted and brought to my attention. But let me start out the questioning with directing it to Bob Bixby, though other members of the panel may wish to participate. In the year 2000, we balanced. In the year 2000, we had a surplus in the federal budget of $86 billion. Now, we've been in deficit ever since, and in deficit the years prior to that, way back to 1974. But we did actually do it in the year 2000. So my question to Bob would be, what did we do right then that is so difficult to replicate now?
Well, I think that there was an accumulation of things. You know, you go back to, say, 1992, when we had, Ross Perot was running and Paul Tsongas was running. The deficit was very high, and the public seemed to be concerned about lowering the deficit. And President Clinton, to his credit, with Alice's help, pushed through a deficit reduction plan. And throughout the 90s, the deficit began to come down. He worked with a Republican Congress, and there was spending restraint, there were budget controls, they avoided tax cuts that weren't matched by spending cuts, they avoided big entitlement expansions. We did have a strong economy. We also had a peace dividend from the end of the Cold War. There were a lot of factors that came together and worked over a number of years to produce this surplus. So I think the lesson from that is that budget deficits don't just go away on their own. When politicians and the public get together and put some effort behind it on a bipartisan basis, fiscal responsibility can work. So it's not a pipe dream. It is, you can look back over that period and say it actually did happen.
I'll turn to Alison, and may I, in turning to you, ask if Graham-Rudman-Hollings had any good effect in that?
I don't think Graham-Rudman-Hollings was a well-intentioned piece of legislation, but it was not effective. The effective thing were the rules that were put in place in 1990 by then President Bush 41 and the Democratic Congress, who, sensing a real crisis, came together, bipartisan, and put in place the budget rules that the Clinton administration benefited from, because they were in effect until 2002. But they were the caps on discretionary spending. Everything had to get under the cap. And the so-called pay-go rules, which meant you couldn't pass, you couldn't even propose a tax cut or an entitlement spending increase unless you had offsets of equal amount over the budget period. It wasn't that the Clinton administration never thought of prescription drugs for Medicare or a middle-class tax cut. In fact, the president had campaigned on it, but we couldn't pay for it. And the rules really worked.
Yeah. I want to, before I turn to David, just to ask Alison on this, because I might get a different point of view, and if I don't, that's fine too. Alice Rivlin identifies the unwillingness to cut taxes as a component in a successful budgetary deficit constraint. Yet good friends of mine on the Laffer curve side of the argument suggest that if we don't occasionally or have targeted tax cuts, we might choke off growth, and growth is a generator of more revenue. Do you want to give us your point? Well, would you kindly give us your point of view on that?
Well, there were a whole lot of questions there that I could tackle. I mean, I think that our tax policy is extremely important. And, you know, that's kind of why I did take some of my presentation time to talk about taxes. Certainly, there are elements of the Laffer curve, I think, that are very important that show that there's sort of an optimum level of taxation and revenue maximization. I think that, sort of in my view, some of the tax cuts that we had in 01 and 03, there were different kinds. Some were growth-oriented tax cuts, and some were really more sort of, I'll call them socially oriented tax cuts. The ones that were growth-oriented I thought were really very effective, and they had much less of a revenue impact. You know, some people feel that they paid for themselves, and there's a lot of very, you know, rigorous debate about that. I think the important thing is that not all tax cuts are created equally. And I don't think that you can cut taxes forever and not have it have a real impact. That being said, I think that, you know, it is important that we seek to keep the burden of taxes on our economy low. And as I showed in one of my charts, taxes are going up. Under current law, they are going to go up for three basic reasons: the alternative minimum tax, the expiration of the tax cuts, and for real growth. So, you know, this sort of normal level of taxation that we've had of about 18% of our economy has, to me, sort of indicated that there's a threshold that Americans and the economy are sort of willing to take.
Before turning to David for his comment, I do want to share one quick comment. When I was in Congress, I had a colleague who honestly said this and then realized what he'd said, that because he totally believed in the Laffer curve, that if only we could get the federal tax rate down to 0, we'd really get federal revenue. I'm glad you got it. He didn't. David.
Well, what I was going to mention is that the budget controls that were in place in the 1990s were a major contributor to help us move from deficits to surpluses, and they expired in 2002. And Washington has been out of touch and out of control. for a number of years, and that was one of the reasons why, because there are no controls in place anymore. You know, some people say during the Johnson administration there was the guns and butter policy. Recently we've had guns and butter and tax cuts. And sooner or later, people need to understand the math has got to work. I mean, the math isn't close to working now, and time is going to make it even more difficult. As Alison said, all tax cuts are not created equally. Some stimulate the economy, some don't. But even the ones that stimulate the economy, they rarely pay for themselves. They may recapture part of the lost revenue through additional economic growth, but they rarely pay for themselves. And we need to recognize that reality as well.
I frequently hear that a capital gains tax reduction does pay for itself based on the record of the Kennedy administration and the Reagan administration. Do you think that's right or wrong, David?
Well, first, the ones that I've seen, I'm not a PhD economist. I'm well-read, but I'm not a PhD economist. And the two that I've heard that typically have the most positive impact and have the potential to pay for themselves are dramatic reductions in marginal tax rates, which we had during the Kennedy administration, and significant reductions in tariffs. Now, obviously, reductions in the capital gains rates, you're dealing with investments, and that you can end up recapturing part of the cost more. Don't know that they'll pay for themselves, but they clearly have more of a stimulative effect. And then you have to ask yourself, how much of that is a timing difference? Because people are accelerating transactions, taxation of transactions, because they may not think it's going to stay that way, versus a longer-term impact. You may.
No, I agree with that. But we have brought the marginal tax rates down so far over time through the Reagan administration, and some of us who are old enough can remember when the marginal top tax rate was 70%, and we're nowhere near that now.
Well, I remember that too. I was pursuing my economic studies at the time. So I have a question from the audience, which is absolutely apt at this very moment. So it begins, which members of the panel are willing to publicly support a tax increase in order to balance the federal and/or California state budget? So the non-Californians can certainly speak to increasing taxes in California. But I'll ask the panel. It's a fair question, and if the answer is no, that's fine. But is there any member who's willing to support a tax increase as part of the solution?
Sure. I mean, I'll go first. To me, the trick here is to try to achieve a sustainable path with spending, taxes, and debt all at levels that are conducive to long-term economic growth. You can't think of taxes and spending as two separate issues. So to the extent that you're not going to make spending reductions, and as we all emphasize, the spending reductions we need to worry about are not the things that you usually hear about, the waste, fraud, and abuse, and the pork barrel spending, earmarks, that sort of thing. It's the two federal health care entitlements and Social Security that are driving the long-term growth. So to the extent that we do not reduce spending on that, we're going to have to raise revenues to pay for it. So I think it's going to take a combination of both, probably.
Very well. David, you're next.
Of the $53 trillion hole that we're in, I think we're going to have to get the most money out of reforming entitlement programs. I think we're also going to have to get some money out of constraining and reprioritizing spending. And I also think that we're going to have more revenues than 18.5% of GDP, which is what we have right now. But that should be achieved through comprehensive tax reform, because I think our current system right now is very inefficient, very ineffective, not very credible. One must keep in mind, based upon the graphic that Alison showed, that under current law, if you do nothing, taxes will rise to about 24% of GDP. We can solve the problem at less than 24% of GDP, at materially less than 24% of GDP. if we act sooner rather than later. On the other hand, if we don't act, then Alison's chart also showed that if you tried to solve the problem through taxes alone, which would be fundamentally imprudent, you go to levels far in excess of that. Americans historically have not allowed themselves to be taxed more than about 20.5% of GDP. That's where we were in 2001. That's one of the reasons that we had a surplus. You may have a little tolerance to go somewhat more than that, but I don't think a whole lot more, and for a variety of reasons.
Any others who want to speak on the tax issue?
Well, I think David's I think David's right that you could balance the long-term budget at almost any level. But the point is, you've got to pay for what you want to do. And the spirit of the fiscal wake-up tour is not everybody says what their favorite solution is. It's that we all agree that there's a big problem and that we have to look at both sides of the budget together and come out somewhere.
It's well said, and I don't mean to put anybody on the spot, but the question did seem to me fair. Let's talk about a few specifics. And there's one other I'd like to get to, but Alison, if you wanted to speak on this issue.
What I would say about California is exactly true as well for this larger problem for entitlements. And as a Californian, or former Californian, I guess, but still a Californian at heart, you know, California already has very high tax rates. And one of the things that, you know, all Californians, whether they live there or not now, need to remember is that, you know, you live in a competitive nation. And you don't want to squeeze your businesses out because that's the source of jobs, it's the source of income, and it's the source of growth. If you raise taxes, there will be some sort of cost on your competitiveness nationally. That very same issue holds true for us nationally as we think about entitlements. If we raise taxes to very high levels, we need to consider our global competitiveness position. And I would say specifically with regard to the corporate income tax, you know, many view big business as, you know, sort of the villain here in society today. But if you think about the corporate income tax, many of our jobs come from big business. The corporate income tax in America is among the highest in the industrialized world already. And if you want to increase taxes on big business, you will be driving away jobs. And that same sort of paradigm holds true for the state of California.
In fact, I might say even more so because the alternatives to locate are right next door. Arizona, Oregon, New Mexico and Texas are bidding for our business. Maybe a little bit more difficult to say we can set up exactly the comparable kind of industrial structure in Mexico, but certainly we could in Arizona. The specific questions that come, ask one or two others, and so let me just briefly put to the panel. Among the others are postponing the retirement age at which your Social Security and Medicare benefits would vest in light of the greater life expectancy from now as opposed to the time when those laws were passed, and or means testing Medicare. And if anybody wishes to make a comment on those possible other specific solutions, I'd welcome it. Yes, David.
I think one of the elements of Social Security reform should include a further increase in not just the normal retirement age and indexing it to life expectancy gradually over time, but also the early retirement age. Because about 70% of people end up taking Social Security at the early retirement age. And the simple fact of the matter is, because of slower workforce growth, because the change in the nature of our economy, because of advancements in medical technology and a variety of other factors, we need to encourage people to work longer. That's what federal policy needs to do. Now, if people can afford to retire earlier, fine, but federal policy needs to encourage people to work longer. Last, on Medicare and health care in general, I think there's no question that federal policy needs to better target taxpayer subsidies for health care and better target tax preferences for health care than we do today.
I think that both of those ideas are ones that the Concord Coalition has supported in the past. There are proposals, for example, the Medicare drug benefit could be means tested. It's not right now. That's one of the proposals. Medicare Part B, which is another part of Medicare, does have a modest means test, simply meaning it's a reduction in the subsidy. I mean, Medicare is Part B and D, the drug program, is 75% financed out of general revenues. And so everybody's getting a subsidy in the size of their premium. So the idea there is it's really not so much means testing as most people understand that, but as a matter of income relating the premium so that upper income people get a less generous subsidy from the other taxpayers. And I think that that's a good idea, but you have to be realistic about the savings you get from something like that. You really don't get huge savings from that. When the Concord Coalition did a means testing proposal back in the mid-90s for all federal entitlement programs, we found that in order to get really big savings, you had to start the means test at about the median income. And a lot of people at that level of income did not consider themselves sufficiently affluent that they should be means tested for anything. So you really do need to I mean, I think those are good ideas, and I think they should definitely be done, particularly changing the longevity, as Dave mentioned, for Social Security and even for Medicare. But on the means testing thing, we should do it, but you're not going to get huge savings out of it.
There are a number of questions on the international implications, so let me turn to that. They go into a couple of different directions, but if I put them out at the same time, perhaps you'd respond to what you were most comfortable responding to. The first would be, are there any lessons that we could learn from other countries which have the same kind of demographic shift or even more so? I might remark in this connection that I was in Japan last week, and of course they have a very big demographic shift towards the older side, and that their budget deficit is running at a ratio of 168% their total debt is 168% of their annual GDP. Our total debt is 67%, so substantially lower as a percentage of our GDP. And then the other direction the questions are running are, should we be concerned that so much of our public debt is held by foreign investors? And Alice referred to that briefly in her remarks, so it might be appropriate to turn to her first on that, but I happen to anticipate that question. And so let me just share with you what the numbers are. Japan is the largest creditor to the United States at $586 billion. China, might say Greater China, which includes Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, as well as mainland China, $400 billion. United Kingdom, $244 billion, and then the Gulf states at $123 billion. So those are the international directed questions.
I think we should be very concerned about the size of our growing debt, but also about the fact that so much of it is held by mostly foreign governments and foreign central banks. It just gives them a lot of leverage over us. And that's not a very good position to be in. Up to now, there's been a kind of codependency. They wanted to keep their currencies from appreciating against the dollar, and we wanted to borrow money, and so it all worked out. But eventually, many countries are going to feel they don't want to hold so many dollars. Some of them already think that. And we don't want to be as beholden to the rest of the world for continuing this paying for our profligacy, which is what it really is, as we are now.
Yeah, David?
You're correct that Japan has a heavier debt burden than we do, and they have, frankly, a bigger demographic challenge than we have. However, they save a lot better than we do. So they owe it to themselves. And another deficit that we have is a savings deficit. Americans in general are great at spending. Think about what happened after 9/11. What did the government tell you to do? Go out and spend money, even if it's more money than you had. And so the problem we have is we're relying upon foreign investors to a much greater extent because we don't have the savings here domestically, which means the debt service payments go overseas. Last thing, yes, there are some lessons learned. There are countries that are ahead of us in dealing with their fiscal challenges. And I'll give you several examples. Canada, UK, Australia. One country that came to the brink of bankruptcy in the late 80s, early 90s was New Zealand. They made dramatic and fundamental reforms in what the government did, how it did business, how it measured success. They made changes in entitlement programs, spending policy, as well as on the tax side. They now have fiscal sustainability for 40-plus years. On the other hand, there's another country that went up to the cliff and went over, and it's called Argentina, with significant adverse consequences to their citizens and many other parties as well.
Alison, go ahead.
I was just going to add to what Dave said, and that is, one of the questions that we get a lot is, well, what's it going to take for us to do this in this country? It can never be done. And I just to build on what Dave said, I think it can be done. And we've seen through some of these international examples that, it does take leadership. It takes a country coming together. It takes dialogue. It takes giving and taking. But it can be done. And, Dave just named some of them. And a number of nations have really tackled their Social Security program. If you think about the healthcare side, Dave's comments earlier about, Medicare and Medicaid, where we essentially write a blank check for huge parts of our budget. Other nations don't do that. They have limited and constrained healthcare spending from the public sector. And I think those are models that we need to look at for this country as well.
You wish to speak more, Alison? Go ahead.
Just a couple of points on this. New Zealand is a wonderful example, and I once talked to the Treasury Secretary of New Zealand about, how did you do this? He said, we didn't have a choice. Nobody's willing to lend us money. And part of our problem is the world has been willing to lend us money, and we didn't have to make the choice.
Well said. In that connection, then, don't you think that China has already expressed its desire to take payments in something that's a basket of currencies? OPEC is expressing the same. Don't you think it's soon that
yes, I think it's
the tolerance of the rest of the world to take dollars will run out?
Yeah.
What I wanted to add, if you'll indulge me for less than 1 minute, is nevertheless a chilling historical example I brought up when we were all together at the Commonwealth Club, but it fits at this moment. And that is for those who remember, or those who read in history, of 1956, the Suez Crisis. England was opposed to Egypt and the United States were opposed to England, France, and Israel. It was an interesting alignment. So the United States stood with Egypt in favor of the allowance of Nasser to nationalize the Suez Canal so long as he paid compensation for it. France, England, and Israel were against. The Israeli troops invaded the Sinai. France and England parachuted troops in purportedly to prevent the two warring parties, Egypt and Israel, from going further. President Eisenhower called up the Prime Minister of England and threatened to sell all at once all of the United States held British debt. And England withdrew, Israel withdrew, France withdrew, and that was two very close allies. Point being that we have a very literal example of the power that the United States gives to another country when we borrow from that other country. David.
Tom, I just want to note, that was an ally.
Yeah.
And you gave me an opportunity here to pitch a commercial documentary that'll be coming out no later than September, called IOUSA, which talks about the four big deficits in America: the budget deficit, the balance of payments deficit, the savings deficit, and the biggest deficit of all, the leadership deficit. And the example that you just gave is covered in the documentary.
It's a moment, thank you, and it's also a moment for me to do what I should have done in my introduction. David Walker is the author of Retirement Security, Understanding and Planning Your Financial Future, and co-author of Delivering on the Promise, How to Attract, Manage, and Retain Human Capital, both available, I assume, on Amazon.
And soon to be a film star in IOUSA.
You too.
Which features everybody else on the panel, too, by the way.
We get a number of
and we're not going to retire on it, that's for sure.
But I think we do a public service if people know that that's available. A number of questions about, okay, what do we do? possibilities of progress seem grim, and a specific suggestion as to whether the 1983 Greenspan Commission on Social Security is a model that we might turn to. And that specific example, for those unfamiliar with it, is an agreement by the Congress to create a commission, Congress and the President. The commission made a series of recommendations, and then Congress voted yes or no on all of them as a package, no amendments possible.
We need more than that, because in 1983, when the Greenspan Commission acted, the U.S. government was in weeks of the Social Security checks not going out on time. If you don't think that would have had political consequences, Social Security checks not going out on time, the modern day equivalent of that is 2041. So we need to act way before the Greenspan Commission did. Secondly, the Greenspan Commission did good work, but they didn't consider the cliff effect of demographics in a 75-year projection, so they knew by definition they had done good work, but it was a temporary fix. They were going to have to come back. This next time we need to do more than that, not to have to be pre-programmed to come back. And in addition, frankly, it's a lot more than Social Security. We're probably going to need a commission that at a minimum will cover budget controls, comprehensive Social Security reform, round one of health care reform, round one of tax reform. Reasonable people can and will differ on what's the best time for the commission. Some would say it's better to do it during the next president and the next Congress, because obviously this president doesn't have much political capital left nor much time left. But I think ultimately we're likely to have to do one with an up or down vote and limited amendments, so you don't pick all the chicken off the bone.
I'd say from another perspective, it worked on the base closing commission. Base closing commission was the same approach. It's very hard, if you're a member of Congress, to vote in favor of closing a base in your own district. I happen to have done so, but it is very hard to do so. If, however, it's part of an entire package, all of these bases have to be closed. Sorry, my district happens to be on the list, but come on, it was done by a neutral process. It's a lot easier to vote for it. Alison?
Everything Dave says is true, but I think the Greenspan Commission was a model in a little different sense. It's good to have a commission to sort of pull the loose ends together and present a specific plan. But it doesn't work unless it's bipartisan and has full political buy-in. And the reason that commission worked was that Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan wanted it to work and gave it its blessing in advance.
I don't think there's any doubt about that, and putting that question forward, that is the model that I meant. Political and all sorts of other balances were essential in that. A number of specifics dealing with the medical costs. I think we touched on them generally, but there may be something else to say about the environmental as a component, not only of medicine, but also as the U.S. enters the Kyoto Protocol, an individual optimistically asks, what will that do to our expected cut in growth rate? So if you take all of the projections that you discussed and then add to it the most recent focus on environmental concerns, which has eluded us, relatively speaking, up until now, what does that do to the projections that underlay your presentations tonight?
Well, I think it makes them worse. What you're essentially talking about are caps or a carbon tax in some sense or another. The models that I've seen and the forecasting that I've seen is that it, has a definite cost on our economy. I can't tell you exactly what the numbers would be, but it definitely will slow us down. And if we're tired of paying high prices for gasoline today, it will be much, much worse under that kind of model. The other thing that goes along with that is, if you want to talk about a carbon tax per se, and Kyoto was not necessarily that, there's lots of ways to get there, but if you want to talk about a carbon tax per se, as many will do, the key concern here is, well, what's Congress really going to do with the money? Do we have confidence that they will reserve that money and put it in a safe place solely to solve this problem? And, I worry about that.
Isn't it logical that a carbon tax is preferable to cap and trade because it does create that opportunity for revenue if Congress will direct it, whereas cap and trade allocates the cost of polluting from one polluter to another?
Well, I mean, you're really looking at a different model. You know, carbon tax goes right to the source of the problem. And cap and trade is setting up a false market. So there's the European experience, my understanding, and I'm not an expert in this, but the European experience has been full of fraud with the cap and trade and the trading that actually goes on. And the allocations, you know, were fraught with problems as well. So, you know, creating a market sounds well and good, but if you want to think about what's happened with ethanol in this country, ethanol has had all kinds of unintended consequences with its noble goal of reducing carbon and reducing pollution. But, you know, the cost of everything not everything, but the cost of many, many things has gone up as a result of our ethanol mandate, from corn to dairy to beef to pork to Coca-Cola. All of those things are going up, and that's just serves to illustrate the unintended consequences of government setting the market.
Thanks, Alison. Alison or Bob?
I think we've got to make energy more expensive if we want to use less of it, and we do. And there are different ways of getting there, and cap and trade isn't free. But I think we can exaggerate the drag on the economy of making energy more expensive. It can also be a benefit. There are lots of jobs and entrepreneurial opportunities in switching to less polluting technologies, and we could be on the forefront of that if we wanted to. Well,
and you know, if we're really worried about carbon, you know, let me throw this out. Nuclear power has tremendous potential for this nation. Other nations are way, way ahead of us, or where we used to be before we essentially regulated nuclear power out of the market. And it has so much potential that, you know, if we were to see a nuclear renaissance in this country, I think there would be a whole lot more markets for things like plug-in hybrids and other kinds of solutions to our energy thing. But, you know, this isn't really an energy wake-up tour. It's a fiscal wake-up tour.
The question, though, is quite relevant to the possibility of achieving our goals here of the fiscal wake-up if on top of the present obligations we have the environmental ones. And maybe cap this off on this discussion simply by asking, am I correct in assuming, and may well not be, that members of the panel would prefer a carbon tax to a cap and trade as between those two from the point of view of their effect on the deficit? Silence is approval.
I think that's too
facile.
Too specific a question. There's a lot of what else are you doing into the bargain.
Fair enough. Let me turn to another specific, which was the war, the cost of maintaining the United States occupation forces overseas, and the fact that that was, with one brief exception, when Alison showed the reduction in the budget expenditure was not touched. Is that a part of the problem, or did you, or what would you like to say about it, David?
So far, we've spent $400 to $500 billion for Iraq, and $600 to $700 billion for the global war on terror. This year, we're expected to spend $180 billion, I believe.
197, I think.
Pardon me?
197, I think, is the going
Yeah,
figure.
180 to 200. It's going up every year. The ultimate cost of Iraq will be between $1 and probably closer to $2 trillion over time. You don't know how long you're going to be there. That's part of the function. But even if you're only going to be there for several more years, in big numbers, okay, the reason being is because you have tail cost. You have the tail associated with you have to replace, refurbish, and reposition equipment. You have tail costs associated with disability and veterans medical care. These costs are recognized on a cash basis, and therefore there's a big tail even after you come out of Iraq. So does it help? No, it hurts. But there's a big difference between Iraq and the things that we're talking about. Iraq is temporary. We don't know how long we're going to be there and what numbers, but we do know it's not going to be forever. The kinds of structural forces that we're talking about today are not temporary. They're much bigger, and they grow with the passage of time.
Yes, Alison.
I think that's the point. I happen to think going into Iraq was a mistake, but a lot of people who share that view think, well, if we just got out of Iraq, we'd solve this budget problem, and that's nonsense. The whole defense budget now, with the Iraq costs in it, is about 4% of GDP. At the height of the Cold War, it was 10% of GDP. We are not spending a lot of money on the military, and we need to spend whatever we need to spend, but it isn't causing the budget problem.
Another way of putting that, I think, is that there is no law that compels us to stay in Iraq. There is a law that compels us to continue making payments on entitlements. Last two sets of questions. The preliminary is the solution to our present economic circumstances with which Congress proposed, is a $600 per individual if you are making below $73,000 of income, a hit to the U.S. budget deficit of $160 billion in the current year. The questioner would like to know is, does that truly add to the deficit, or is it more important to stimulate economic growth to get out of the potential recession?
Well, I mean, it adds to the deficit. The hope is that it would mitigate or avoid a potential recession. It's an intense, I mean, that deficit spending in this case is done intentionally to have a positive economic effect. It does have, by adding to the deficit, a long-term cost in that it's got interest costs that go forward. I think the CBO said that it would add something like $70 billion of interest costs over the next 10 years. It's something that, you know, as a deficit hawk, I'm quite cautious about and think that, you know, perhaps Congress should be concentrating on these long-term problems. But if it is clearly a temporary thing, a targeted thing to try to stimulate the economy, then you know, maybe it's certainly justifiable. But it's not the sort of thing that is going to, and it shows you how we have this intense focus on the short term, and Congress can come together very quickly on a package of economic stimulus because it is the easy thing to do because it's intentionally raising the deficit, and you say you're doing it for a good purpose. The more difficult thing is Congress coming together on the more difficult choices to do something about the long-term problems that we've talked about.
Another point of view on that? Yes, David?
Well, I think Alice wanted to go
Alice,
first.
I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Well, I think this is a hard question for us deficit hawks. I have testified twice now that I think the stimulus was worth it, as long as it's kept temporary. But it should be paid for. Coming back to the famous PAYGO rules, we should pay for this stimulus over a 5-year period. And if you do that, you still have a modest amount of interest on the increase in the deficit for 1 year, but it isn't very expensive.
Yeah, if you came back and yeah, go ahead.
Well, you know, I have a little bit different view of the stimulus, but the point that I want to make is to really echo what Bob said, is that it's really easy to spend money, especially when you throw all the rules aside. And I was very pleased to see the stimulus that was targeted, temporary, and you know, very measured, really. What worries me is that now Congress has set this precedent, and there's talk of a stimulus 2 and a stimulus 3. And we just have to be very, very careful that, you know, the stimulus wasn't paid for, there's no plan, all the budget rules like PAYGO were set aside, and, you know, are we talking about solving the real challenge? No.
I think that's a big key. I agree with what Alice had to say. When I testified, I said it had to be timely, targeted, and temporary, and that was before I read what came out of Brookings. I mean, it was amazing. They said a similar thing. It is temporary, that's for sure. They were timely with regard to how quickly they acted, but it's not as timely with regard to how quickly the checks will come out, although some people tend to spend things based on the fact that they know they're going to get it. And it was not adequately targeted, in my view. It wasn't paid for, which it should be. But I think the real point is this. Look at all the time and effort that the Congress, the President, the Fed is spending right now to try to avoid a recession or to minimize a recession. Recessions happen. Nobody's repealed the business cycle. Whether or not we're going to be able to avoid it now, only time will tell, but we won't avoid it forever. We're spending all this time and effort on a possible avoidance of a recession, and we're spending no time on the real problem. And if people think that a recession is going to be a problem, you ain't seen nothing yet, because the type of economic disruption that could occur if we don't start dealing with our real problem could let many Americans know for the first time in their life what real economic hardship is.
Final point on that. I think we need to learn that we can walk and chew gum at the same time on fiscal issues. Short-term problems and long-term problems can be susceptible to different solutions. So if you're worried about the short-term budget, you can worry about a stimulus package, you can worry about the recession, you can worry about the war. We should manage the budget in the short term. But that doesn't mean that you need to simultaneously ignore the long-term challenges, because you can phase in changes there over many years that will have a substantial effect that would not have a bad effect in the short term. So I think that being able to look short-term, long-term is really crucial on all this, and separate the two.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And those 2 or 3 things that we talked about earlier, changing the retirement age, you can phase that in. And the same thing with the premiums. And, I think that over the long term, they would have substantial savings towards this problem. And then you would get momentum going and interest and, a little bit of reassurance that Congress really can do something.
I want to underline Alison's point she made regarding once you break the rules, it's easier the next time. Alice Rivlin referred to the pay-go rules that helped us get to budget balance in 2000. They began to erode, however, with what was called an urgent supplemental. So pay-go worked unless it was an urgent supplemental. And I remember a bill for the recovery from Hurricane Andrew was an urgent supplemental, which included rebuilding the federal courthouse in New York City. The hurricane came nowhere near New York City, thus the illustration of the danger. Our last question is a political one. I suspect you're not surprised to know that a number of our students, staff, and faculty want to know which of the presidential candidates best embodies the hope to address the problems that you've discussed tonight. And so on this one, I'm going to call on each of you in turn and also give you the chance to say any final remarks that you might, as this will be our last question. So perfectly randomly, let me start with Dave Walker, which I just randomly chose.
I don't endorse presidential candidates. I'm an independent, and I'm staunchly nonpartisan. This won't tell you much. I feel reasonably comfortable that 2 out of the 3 get it and might do something about it. The other one, I have no idea.
That's really enigmatic. Alice Rivlin?
I think that Senator McCain has demonstrated in the past that he gets it and has been quite strong on fiscal responsibility. And I'm a Democrat, but I'm a little more nervous about the Democrats in what they've been saying, because they talk more about spending and less about what they would do about any long-run deficit. But I do think that both of the Democratic frontrunners are intelligent people who, when faced with the facts, will do the right thing.
Thank you. Alison?
Yeah, I don't endorse candidates either, and neither does my organization. That being said, I'm hopeful that when we have the next president, whoever that might be, that we do have real leadership because we need it. The first baby boomer has already retired. So that tsunami that we all talked about is already coming our way, and we need real leadership.
Thank you. And Bob Bixby?
Well, we don't endorse candidates either, so have to be careful on that. I do think two things. If you want to take the glass half full, if you want to be gloom and doom, you can look at what they're saying and say none of these candidates are seriously addressing the problems that we've talked about tonight. If you want to be more hopeful about it, you can say that I think all of my hopeful spin on it anyway is that I think all of the three remaining contenders have the intelligence and the leadership capability, have demonstrated that to be able to deal with these issues. And really, it's a question of whether or not they will rise to that challenge. And during the campaign, I think it's terribly crucial that they not take options off the table. If they demonstrate that they know that there's a problem, they know something about the magnitude of it, they demonstrate that there's a need for trade-offs and that we have to act sooner rather than later on this, I think that any one of those three could potentially lead on this issue.
Well, I think we all owe a great debt of gratitude to these four individuals who have given of their time and exceptional expertise to try to wake up our country to a very serious problem. I want to thank Bob Bixby, David Walker, Alice Rivlin, and Alison Acosta-Fraser for their time and for their sharing that time with the Berkeley community. Won't you join me in thanking them?